By 2005, they're making $20 to $30 billion a year. And this is the cartel operating at its peak. They blow the doors off the vaults. People start running in and start stealing money. And so that creates the distraction necessary for their leaders to get away. The authorities were able to get a lead on Chapo Guzman. They had a tunnel underneath the bathtub. So he's naked running through the tunnels.
Today, my guest is... right? Like, that's how I should do it. So, no. Today, my guest is Pierre Rausini, my buddy Pete. Mm-hmm. And Pete was charged in 1998 under the federal drug kingpin charge. Is that wrong? Statute. What does it matter? He was a Beverly Hills based. Look at your face. You're so disappointed. Come on, listen. So Pete's a buddy of mine. He was charged as a under the kingpin statute in 1998, and he has an extensive knowledge on the cartels and the underworld, and we're going to get into the rest of the cartel story from we're roughly around the year 2005, 7, 8-ish, early 2000s. We're going to bring it all the way to current times.
When people talk about the Sinaloa cartel,
right,
the images that they come to mind are essentially that stretch of period between mid-2003 and mid-2010, what we refer to generally as the golden era. And so by 2004, they had established themselves as the preeminent group. They had gone from being the weakest to the most powerful in a span of about 15 years. And by 2005, they're generating somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 billion a year. You got $2 to $3 billion a month coming to Los Angeles.
It's a lot of pesos.
Well, no, they're American dollars.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so that's where you get the fields of cash just buried in Mexico, because there's literally trailers filled with cash that they are scrambling to try to surface. You know, Guadalajara quickly became the money laundering capital of the world. Los Angeles became the money laundering capital of the United States. In particular, the passports would have been enormous. The false identities would have been enormous, because that would have allowed them to set up offshore trusts that were not tied to Americans.
Yeah.
And so, like in my case, I had Brazilian passports, but I wasn't utilizing it for, like, I didn't have the knowledge that I have now that I didn't make that. Then I was just duffel bags of cash.
Now you're dangerous. They fucked up. So what else happened? What's going on? Where's Chapo?
Well, by 2004, the Sinaloa Federation exercised control over an 800-mile stretch of the border, encompassing some 24 ports of entry. And what distinguished Sinaloa from the other groups was the fact that they were very disciplined and they focused only on drug trafficking, whereas the other syndicates were more of your conventional organized crime. That's what got the Zetas in trouble. When they took over a town, they took over everything. Stolen cars, prostitution, fencing stolen goods. Well, you create a lot of antipathy with the local authorities. Whereas if you're just passing through town, paying them some money, and we're taking this to the gringos, yeah, keep it going.
Right.
And so that's one of the fundamental differences between Sinaloa and the other organizations. Also, another key aspect to understand is that Sinaloa was not vertically integrated. It was basically a horizontally based organization which structured its operations around the notion that different drug kingpins operated in different regions. And so there wasn't a duplication of efforts. The guy that's in Jalisco has to worry about the money laundering and operating the labs. The guy in Colima, you manage the ports. Now, the guy in Colima, he doesn't have to worry about the tunnels because somebody else has got the tunnels.
Right.
And so they were able to, by segregating the responsibility, the sum of the whole was significantly greater than the individual parts.
So it's a whole assembly line operation.
Well, yeah, and that's another one of the main distinctions. And of course, the ace up their sleeves was with Zambada having figured out a way how to manipulate the Americans into targeting their rivals. They were able to now create what were essentially pincer movements. And so when they took over Tijuana, for instance, they literally unleashed the Americans, which manipulated their lackeys in the Mexican government to start targeting the leaders and their top lieutenants, while Zambada sent his group of armed gunmen into Tijuana. And so what they started doing was neutralizing the local police force. Like the chief of police got killed, his captain gets killed, a number of the lieutenants get killed. And so when the new police administration comes in, they're taking the position of saying, hey, look, we of course want to keep getting our paychecks and their envelopes of cash, but we're not going to intervene in your guys' struggle. You go at it, boys. So the people in Tijuana, they actually lost their political protection. And so what was before a single unitary group controlling that plaza, now you had two groups. Well, and that's the thing that's...
And they're fighting, right?
Yes, but that was the main point is Sinaloa learned an important lesson. You don't need to control the ports of entry that are outside of their territory. They just need access to them. A lot of times it's better off renting than buying.
Right. Okay.
So if you live in Tampa and you're going to work in St. Louis for a few months, you're not going to buy a house, you're just going to rent. Well, that's what they essentially started doing. They're saying, hey, you know what? We're going to put our people there. Now, of course, the locals didn't appreciate it, so it was a long simmering conflict. But Sinaloa had a practice they called heating up the plaza. And what they meant by that was if the locals get out of line, the Sinaloa gunmen will come in town, commit some atrocity, kill a bunch of cops, kill some of the rival cartel guys, creating a spectacle that prompts the federal authorities to come in. And so when federal law enforcement comes in, they're targeting the locals. So for the locals in these particular regions, whether it was Tijuana, whether it was Juarez, whether it was Nuevo Laredo, they learned quickly that engaging in conduct that's going to attract the attention of the authorities is going to redound to their own detriment.
Right.
And so they kind of had to have like long simmering conflicts that every once in a while has, like, you know, had a sporadic outbreak, but then it was quickly put back in line. And so, you know, by 2005, which is where we stopped the last podcast, essentially Sinaloa had utilized that model to now have access to the plaza in Tijuana, access to the plaza in Juarez, access to the plaza in Nuevo Laredo. Well, all of a sudden, they now had the ability to take the sum total of all the cocaine or other contraband that Tijuana and the Gulf were doing. They could now handle it all themselves. And so what they did is they established a model where they're saying we're going to create disarray in the local community. So they have the Americans unleash the Mexican military. You've got the gunmen coming into town, destabilize the local venue, and then come in and say, hey, look, we're here, but we're willing to share. And ultimately that proved to be very successful because they didn't have the responsibility of maintaining control, but they got all the benefits. Now, what was your earlier question?
Well, my question was, where's Chapo in this whole thing? Like, he's got a. What was the last podcast? Was he arrested and he was just hanging out?
No,
and then they broke him out.
They broke him out of prison.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
In 2001.
That's right.
And so between 2001 and 2004, that's when they were effectively utilizing the American authorities to target their enemies.
Right.
So by the time 2004 came around, you know, Chapo was actually going into Nuevo Laredo. This is key Gulf cartel territory. And so, remember, the purpose of the Federation, the 28 organizations coming together, was to stop the Gulf cartel juggernaut. And through a pincer movement where they were targeted law enforcement action with targeted military action, allowed them to say they were able to stop the Zetas and the Gulf from advancing. And then what Guzman did was he had his cousin, Beltran Leyva. They put together their own essential like paramilitary type group called Los Negros, who was under the leadership of a guy named Barbie.
And Barbie. Barbie's he's the American, right?
He's the American. He's a Texan, you know, and blonde hair, blue eye, good friend with the guy that we knew from prison.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, loved his women, loved fashionable attire. And
that's why they called him Barbie. So he looked like a Ken doll, right? Wasn't it?
No, yeah. And so Barbie put together a group known as Los Negros, and they took it to the Gulf cartel in their own territory. So obviously they had no chance of knocking them off in Matamoros or knocking them off in Reynosa. Nuevo Laredo was different, but the other two, they couldn't. But by attacking them in their backyard, now the Gulf people had to call back their own military personnel to come defend.
Right.
So that stopped the onslaught. So they've achieved their goal. By 2005, things were stabilized. And that's when Chapo started pulling off his silliness, which sometimes they just couldn't leave well enough alone.
What's silliness? Give me a...
Well, they had entered into an alliance with the Juarez cartel. Because Juarez, you got to go through Juarez to get to Sinaloa. So they're on the chopping block. So, of course, they jumped into bed with Sinaloa. They utilized the Juarez Plaza to move product through, developed relationships with the locals. Then Chapo he's eyeing that territory. So he ends up entering into a deal with Esparragosa, the number 2 in Juarez. And they decide, you know what, let's remove the leadership and take over. Now, these are the kind of moves that Zambada was famous for. He'll encourage, Zambada will fight Juarez to the last of Chapo's men.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I'm willing to spend every single dime of his money.
That's essentially what happened. And so, they put together this plan where Rodolfo had family members in Sinaloa. They ended up killing the guy when he was visiting. That's the guy at the shopping mall.
Oh, yeah.
And then that launches a little war within Juarez. And you have to understand, this, by 2005, it kind of stalemated, and then it just started picking up. By 2007, 2008, Juarez is the murder capital of the world. There's more fatalities in Juarez than in Baghdad.
Right.
I mean, it just escalated into this enormity. But at the outset, it was just a pure double cross. And it was the same model based on the Tijuana model, where they said, okay, you know what? We don't have enough strength to overtake it. But that's not necessary, because now they've got their man. These two groups are fighting each other, but they've got access to the importation route. So again, they benefited from destabilizing the locals, and then they kept their, one step removed. And Chapo did this with several groups, and later on this became an issue because the subordinates that he was farming out to actually do the dirty work started accumulating too much power. Beltran-Leyva comes to a negotiated standstill in Nuevo Laredo. That's the biggest port of entry in the United States for commercial trucks. You're 30 miles from San Antonio. From there, it's a straight shot up to Chicago.
All right.
I mean, that's an enormous asset. They took over the entire Arizona border. They knocked off the Sonora cartel. Beltran-Leyva, again, stepped in, took all of that. That's the guy from the story you wrote, Unlikely Narco.
Right.
Between Arturo and Barbie, and, they ended up getting on a run there where they essentially took from Arizona through New Mexico was theirs. Then this one port in Texas. And so you see this happening where the subordinates start accumulating too much power, and Chapo, being Chapo, decides to start double-crossing them. And so at this point, he's launched an unprovoked attack on Juarez, launched an attack on Nuevo Laredo, after already having secured Tijuana. And so by 2005, like I said, they're making $20 to $30 billion a year. And this is the cartel operating at its peak. And so you had like a 7-year run before the wheels ultimately fell off. And so when people talk about today, the Sinaloa cartel, look, what they're talking about has almost no correlation to what was happening back then.
Right.
The groups today are just essentially a fraction of that operation. That was truly something that in the annals of organized crime or drug trafficking has never been replicated, has never even been approached.
Well, at what point does Chapo get caught? Like at some point it falls apart. He gets caught again and goes back to prison.
That's in 15.
Okay.
Yes, and so...
Where are we now?
You're in 2005.
My God. Let's move forward here.
Well, the thing is this. The backdrop to the story is his underhandedness. In one of the main individuals who were...
Are you suggesting that a cartel member isn't playing fair?
Well,
My God, Pete.
Look, a lot of it was just unadulterated greed.
Right.
There was a guy named Armando Valencia, enormous trafficker. And one of the main guys in the backstory of my case. And Valencia was the one who created essentially the market for the synthetics. And he had, labs all over the world, all over the place in Jalisco, Michoacan, Colima, Nayarit. It was the world's largest trafficker of ephedrine. And so he forms an alliance with Nacho Coronel. Well, this is an independent revenue stream that Chapo Guzman and Mal Zambada had no part of. This is how Coronel developed so much power.
Okay.
And so they had 100% control, essentially, of, we'll say at one time, the methamphetamine market.
Right.
And none of the other groups had any access to it. So this enormous war chest. And so what happens, all of a sudden in 2003, Armando Valencia gets knocked off. Like he's at a bar having drinks with his buddy. Here's the article from the New York Times. Mexico arrests 8 top drug smugglers, one of whom is Armando Valencia.
Just by a fluke?
Just by, essentially. Well, and later on, of course, when Valencia and I are bullshitting together in prison, I'm like, what happened?
All right.
At that point, they're not thinking it's Chapo.
Yeah.
He's just thinking, man, what happened? His political protection broke down. Every once in a while, a highway patrol officer stumbles upon something.
Right. Yes.
You can't eliminate that. And so, but at that point, Valencia gets moved out of the way. Well, his brother takes over, but Oscar Valencia isn't on the same stature. Valencia was the guy dealing with Mayo and dealing with Amaro Carrillo. All of a sudden, the brother now, instead of being an equal with Coronel's operation subsumes it. Then who becomes Coronel's partner? Chapo. So now Chapo to the exclusion of Mayo Zambada and everybody else. So all of a sudden now he moved into an entire new venue where him and Coronel had complete control. This is what plants the seeds later on for Coronel's ultimate demise.
Right.
And so you see that same model keeps replacing. Like he gets somebody in close, then he removes the individual from the equation and takes everything over. Well, at some point, that's not sustainable.
Right. Pretty soon, nobody wants to be your friend.
Well, that's what precipitated the collapse. But in 2003, they didn't know about this, right? They just poor Armando got knocked off. It was just a bad luck. Then they do the same thing with Rodolfo Carrillo. They straight out betrayed him. Well, the other guys knew it, but they were on board with it. Like it's no problem. The leader of the Gulf Cartel was arrested after Guzman and Zambada were able to manipulate the Americans into targeting the Mexican authorities towards taking down the leadership and its top lieutenants. And that ended up creating an interesting dynamic because after Ocasio Cardenas is taken into custody, he's able to maintain communication with his operatives via cell phone. However, when the top dog goes to jail, he's still nominally in control, but the problem is the guys on the street, they're all still now vying for power. Mm-hmm. And so what started as strife within the group ultimately leads to the Gulf Cartel fracturing because you have the Zetas who were loyal to Cardenas. Cardenas is in prison. Well, some other flunky wants to take over. Well, they're not going to listen to the flunky.
Right.
And so the military guys, and at this point, this is still core Zetas. At this point, there's 30 of the original 36 are still special forces guys. And so they're not going to follow just any schlub.
Right.
Meanwhile, the organization itself is reeling because they've got the pressure from the Americans. They've got Sinaloa sending their armed militiamen into their territory. And what was unknown to anybody at that time was Ocasio Cardenas had begun secretly cooperating. So he's earning cooperation credit while in custody, meeting with high-level DOJ, DEA, State Department officials, essentially targeting his rivals within the cartel. So he's giving up people.
Right.
And
is this the lawyer? This isn't the lawyer.
No, this is the head of the Gulf Cartel himself.
Okay, sorry.
And so this is the guy in The Unlikely Narco, Vicente Guerrero. That's that case.
Okay, this is he's been caught.
He's been caught.
So he's incarcerated, trying
in Mexico,
to get himself out of prison or get his sentence reduced.
Trying to mitigate his culpability.
He's trying to reduce the amount of time he's going to have to serve in prison by giving people up.
By giving up his enemies.
Or what my people in the comments like to say, ratting. He's snitching.
Okay, well,
I like to say cooperation, whatever.
So this, of course, causes a big problem because now the Gulf and the Zetas, you got internal strife within the Gulf. You got strife between the Gulf and the Zetas. So finally, the Zetas is like, you know what, screw this, we're just taking over. And this precipitates the crisis that results in the number 3 guy for the Zetas, because at this point, Z1's already been killed, Z2's already been apprehended. So now Z3 takes over, a guy named Lascano. Well, Lascano takes over, and you've got a period of just uncomfortable relations between the two groups. Later on, within a few years, is when the Zetas completely break away, and that's where you're going to have what ultimately became the big clash of the Titans, essentially.
Right.
But this is that signature event that started this down this walkway, where the Zetas quickly began to suspect that Cardenas may be cooperating because there's caches of cash that are getting discovered.
That only he would have known about.
It's like, well, who's giving, because and Cardenas ends up turning over, tens of millions of dollars. And so now it's like, even if individuals are getting knocked off, nobody's giving up the cash stashes.
Right.
And so they quickly figure out, hey, something is amiss. Cardenas's cooperation, which plants the seeds that ultimately result in what becomes the rupture between the Gulf Cartel and its Zeta allies. And all it is turmoil, of course, works to Sinaloa's benefit, because now that they've got these groups infighting with each other, now they send in their gunmen. So once again, they were constantly destabilizing and stealing territory. And so while they weren't ultimately able to capture the first 2, Reynosa or Matamoros, they were ultimately able to come to an agreement with Nuevo Laredo, which is like just an enormous plum. Thus, by 2006, Sinaloa was sitting pretty. They had control of 800 miles of the border, 24 ports of entry, complete control of the methamphetamine market. They had taken over the bulk of the cocaine market. They had adopted several new additional plazas when the unexpected happened. And 2006 was the year that there was a president that gets elected in New Mexico named Calderon. And Calderon won what was a highly contested election. Right. Some say it was actually stolen. And so he came in very weakened. And so in this weakened condition, he turned to the Americans for assistance. This is when George Bush and his administration were in the midst of his war in Iraq. And so they had that wartime mentality. And so Calderon, in order to shore up his standing within the Mexican community and with the Americans, comes in and declares war on the cartels. So now, what's interesting about this is Calderon declares war in December of 2006. He appoints as the security, there's an individual that's the equivalent of the FBI in Mexican government, the public minister for state security, one of those type of job titles. Well, the guy he puts in charge is a man named Genaro Luna. Well, what's interesting about Luna is he'd been on the payroll of Sinaloa for 5 years.
Yeah, he doesn't make him super solid for that.
Well, it makes him very solid for the guys that are paying him.
Yeah.
So as soon as Calderon takes office, Luna gets made their equivalent of FBI director. Zambada sends his brother to go make a delivery to Luna. Here's several more million. Congratulations on your appointment.
Right? We're still good, right?
So now what does Luna do? He goes to Calderon and says, we've declared war on the cartels. Let's send our men into Juarez.
Is there anybody in Juarez?
Well, what is the people Sinaloa is fighting?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So they launched and they
We
sent,
have to get these drug dealers off
so
the
they
street.
sent 3,400 soldiers into Juarez. They sent 2,500 into Tijuana. They sent another 2,000 into Nuevo Laredo. You know where they never went?
Sinaloa?
That's right. They never went to Sinaloa.
There's nothing in there anyway.
There's no one there.
Yeah.
And so they stayed away from Guadalajara. They stayed away from Sinaloa. They send in the troops. Now the troops, of course, are, for the Sinaloa guys, they're sitting back, letting the Mexican military now essentially clean up for them.
Well, wipe out their enemies, yeah.
Yes, and so this creates, again, that same type of destabilization dynamic where now they're able to come in and say, hey, look, we're here, we're operating, and if you got a problem, Mexicans are going to come in.
Right.
Because they could just pick up the phone and call Luna.
Right.
And so over the course of that next year, they started, I mean, it was like 3,000 guys, 4,000 guys, 5,000. I mean, at some point, they've got like 10, 12,000 men in each of these cities. Essentially, the Mexican military is in a full-on engagement, a crackdown on the cartels that ultimately results in being a windfall for Sinaloa.
I mean, I guess, like, you know, I mean, I like to think that you would think that like the Americans would have their pulse on what's happening. Like, don't they see that this is what's happening? Like, we're not getting rid of this. We're just, you know, like, don't they see the strategy, or does it take years later for them to realize, like, fuck, this is what happened? Like, doesn't the president of Mexico realize, like, this isn't eliminating anything at this point, the drug activity?
See, the thing is, you know, in the whenever there's politics involved, things don't make sense.
Right.
And for Calderon, it was a way to shore up credibility with the electorate. The American government, upon him doing what he was doing, said, well, no, we're going to put together a support package. It was called one of those, like Meridia Initiative. Mm-hmm. They ended up giving these guys like $1.5 billion. They're funding the Calderon administration, who's relying on Luna to attack the cartels. Luna is taking millions from Sinaloa.
Right.
So all that American money is coming in to wipe out Sinaloa's enemies. And so it turns into a situation where it's almost like a comedy skit.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. Yeah.
And so
you would think that, like, here's the thing though. Sometimes, I mean, my understanding is, look, first of all, you're not going to get rid of the guys, right? Unless you just wipe out everybody. But if one group is in charge and you can limit the amount of violence, then it does it. You're moving stuff across the border. You're flooding your little towns with money. As long as they're not, you know, shooting each other and shooting civilians and everything, and they're really just flooding the area with money and exporting drugs to the Americans, like, in a way, it's like, what does it matter? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's a good thing.
Well, that was the state of affairs up until about 2000.
Okay.
Like, had the Gulf not initiated an effort to wipe out the other cartels,
right,
they would have, I mean, that was essentially the model for decades. The Mexican political structure didn't care. They just don't keep the stuff in Mexico, send it on to the Americans.
All right.
And everybody, they're just all pigs feeding at the same trough.
Right.
It was only when you started getting, you know, these personal type disputes where you couldn't resolve the situation. You know, Cadillo Fuentes kills Chapo's brother.
Right.
You know, Arianos kill Bueno Palma's wife. Like these kind of situations where you're not going to resolve it through a negotiation.
No, so yeah, I got to wipe you out completely. You have to be completely.
But, you know, other than those personal disputes, had they not precipitated the conflict, you would have never received this kind of level of attention.
Right.
And so what worked to Sinaloa's benefit is when their FBI director said, you know what, La Familia Michoacana, let's take them out. Well, that's the local group in Michoacan.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that they just started rolling up these other organizations that resulted in a greater consolidation of Sinaloa power. And the one that they started focusing a lot of their attention on were the Zetas. Because like I said earlier, the Zetas were not naturally a drug trafficking group. They were a paramilitary wing providing protection. And so when they took over, they didn't control territory so much as they just controlled rackets. And so, and given their extreme level of violence, they became a natural target. So as long as you've got someone that you can deflect attention to, you know, the people in Sinaloa looked reasonable compared to the Zetas.
Right.
And so they were able to say, hey, look, we're not causing you any problems. We're just responding to their provocations. Meanwhile, we're also giving you guys millions of dollars in cash. So it was an easy maneuvering for Luna and those other politicians on the take to say, hey, you know, let's focus on these other groups. And so by 2008, you now have the Mexican government literally at war with 3, if not 4, of the cartels that were the direct enemies of Sinaloa.
Okay.
And so you've got the Americans targeting them, Mexican military targeting them, Sinaloa's gunmen's targeting them. And while all this is going on, they're just rolling in the dough at this point.
Right.
Another development that Calderon pursued that really changed the character of the drug war was when he approved the extradition of Mexican nationals to the United States, even if they're facing a life sentence. See, prior to 2006, the only Mexicans who can get extradited to the U.S. were individuals who were not facing life or capital charges.
Right.
Well, the Mexican Supreme Court changed that rule and said, well, you can send them even if they're facing a life sentence. And that caused a fundamental change because before the guys, when they were surrounded, like, okay, go to jail for a few years.
Yeah. Get out. We get to bring in hookers and see our family and have babies and eat like kings. And
yes. And so their experience in prison is fundamentally different than how yours was in prison.
Right.
Well, that changed after 2006. In fact, one of the first things he did to demonstrate to the Americans how serious he was, he sent 150 guys to the United States. And that's how Armando Valencia ended up in prison with us. Or with me, excuse me, not you. And that's how Obama ended up. That's how Javier Torres. I mean, like all of a sudden, Ociel Cardenas, just these enormous drug lords who before went peacefully to Mexican prison thinking, okay, they're going to do their years there.
Right.
All of a sudden now they get double-crossed and essentially end up in American prisons. Well, from that point forward, the guys on the street back in Mexico are saying, hey, they're not going.
Right. They're fighting to death. That's where you start getting these shootouts.
That's where you start getting these extraordinary shootouts. And it results into a militarization of the cartels against the Mexican government. And that's where you start getting these blatant attacks of soldiers, ambushes, which of course starts reciprocal escalation. Pretty soon, you've got Mexican military personnel flooding these cities because they're dealing with just this onslaught of attacks. And so Calderon's decision to start extraditing really not only changed the drug war, but it also, again, benefited Sinaloa. Why do you say? Because they had the FBI director in their pocket.
Right.
So they're the right thing to just go arrest all these people and send them out of the country. I mean, it's all fun and games when somebody else is getting extradited. It's not fun when it's you.
Right.
But they're just banking on not getting caught. Or if they are going to get caught, go out in a shootout.
Right. Well, they keep getting raided. They're raiding everybody else, all these other states and not their states. So and then they have the heads up like they're not going to raid Sinaloa and we're safe here in the mountains. We're good. We're never going to get
there was like a funny story where one of the DEA agents couldn't understand how did Chapo keep escaping.
Right.
And they're like, and one of them joked around and saying, well, there isn't a word in Spanish for surrounding.
Right.
Like they never surrounded the house. He got out the back door. Right. He got out the back door. It's like, why don't you surround the building before you go in? And of course, they were always tipped off. And so they went through the efforts of pretending to be Johnny on the spot just so they can keep the money coming in from the United States. But in reality, we now know they're completely protected. And we only came to know that because during Chapo's trial, it came out to light that this guy was on the take.
Right.
So then subsequently, he was ultimately arrested because he made the mistake of moving to Miami. So they were able to grab him. Like he retired with his millions, moved to Miami. They snatched him up.
God, could you imagine? You've done all this and you thought, I pulled it off. You're kicked back. You're playing fucking shuffleboard.
He's a private security guard. He's a private security consultant. So he's collaborating with the CIA. He's collaborating with federal.
It's even worse. I'm even deeper. I've been deeper in now.
Deeper. And so, yeah, he recently went to trial. He was convicted. He's looking at life. And so, in fact, his story would be a great Patreon. And so, yes. And so long as he was in a position to deflect for them. Once again, they were the beneficiaries. So it kind of gives you a little sense of how you were able to create such an enormous juggernaut, because it wasn't simply just serendipity.
Right.
It was actually orchestrated through primarily, corruption, but to a lesser extent, violence, with the corresponding benefit of removing from the equation pretty much most of Sinaloa's enemies.
Hey, real quick, just wanted to let you guys know that we're looking for guests for the podcast. If you think you'd be a good guest or you know somebody, do me a favor. You can fill out the form. The link is in our description box, or you can just email me directly. Email is in the description box. So back to the video.
After the leader of the Gulf Cartel was extradited to the United States in 2007, the fact of OCL Cardenas' cooperation became publicly known. That's what prompted the Zetas to completely just go to war against the Gulf.
Right.
Because at this point, a number of their highly ranking individuals were already knocked off, presumably because of Cardenas' cooperation. Boatloads of money had already been lost. And so for them, they're like, you know what, screw this. We're not going to be listening to these flunkies anymore. And so what you had was a military campaign against the Gulf where the Zetas essentially took over that cartel. This, of course, works to Sinaloa's benefits because the Zetas at this point had created so much attention from the government that they essentially declare war against that particular cartel. Not just the crooked FBI director that they have down there, but the government itself. The Calderon administration is like, look, we got to take these individuals out because they're just literally going on rampages where they're, multiple dozen police officers getting killed. They're just dumping the bodies out there. I mean, it was just, the kind of actions that make no sense.
Right.
And the greater the atrocities, the more attention and the more of a pretext it gives them to say, you know what, we're going to focus all our attention over here. So while you've got the northeast of Mexico being completely destabilized as these two groups are going to war with each other, you had an event out in Sinaloa that was critical in the sense that it was the first of the main Sinaloa drug lords gets apprehended. There's a guy named...
On purpose? Just an accident?
Yes, again, it's not Arturo's older brother.
Okay.
And so when he gets taken down, the rest of the people within his group suspect Guzman of having double-crossed him.
Okay.
Now, from all of the information that's been publicly revealed concerning this, that wasn't the case. He just had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
But it's not like it's beneath.
Yes, that's what the
Chapo.
other guys. That's how, and so that is the conclusion they immediately drew.
Right.
And so the Beltran Leyvas, you have to understand when Guzman assigned responsibility to Beltran, it's his cousin. You put together the Los Negros, you put together the paramilitary wing, and start pushing up. Well, Beltran Leyva accumulated a lot of power. He basically controlled all of Arizona's border, all of New Mexico's border. He handled much of the corruption. And so at some point, they're thinking, it wouldn't be beyond the pale for Guzman to have done what they were suspecting him of having done.
Right.
Turns out he didn't do it, though. But, you operate with the information that was known. Arturo drew the conclusion that he was responsible. So that precipitates Arturo now to launch an attack on Guzman. They kill his son. So now this, of course, precipitates an enormous
Blood feud. It's
blood feud.
Yeah.
And this is within core Sinaloa, and this isn't Federation. Because at this point, the Federation is already a little bit in tatters because the outer proximities are starting to realize that, our benefits no longer outweigh the cost of being associated with these guys.
Right.
And so the first of the core Sinaloa group decides, we're breaking off on our own. Well, Beltran Leyva, a very powerful faction of the core Sinaloa group, enters into an alliance with the Zetas. Remember, he's the one who had Nuevo Laredo.
Right.
So he has a working relationship already. So he leaves and joins forces with them. And so this is the first of the splintering of core Sinaloa because you lose one of the main factions.
Right.
And it was a collapse based on a flawed assumption. Like this is what we were talking about earlier, why you can't engage in fraud.
Right.
Because there are certain things that are just beyond your control. This is one of those events that nobody could have contemplated.
Right. Okay.
And so this causes these two guys to start going to war. Now, a year later, the head of the Valencia organization, his brother, Oscar Valencia, he gets arrested. Just a mid-level guy. But he was a core associate of Cartel's ring. So now Oscar Valencia falls out of the way. A year later, here comes Cartel. Cartel ends up stuck in this bad jam. See, and this is the way,
So isn't this pretty much the whole organization is crumbling at this point, right? Or,
that's, at this point, it's the deception of Guzman that is causing a lot of these issues. Like, he marries Nacho Cartel's niece. Emma Cartel is Nacho's niece. So he forms this alliance. They call it the Alianza de Sangre, the Blood Alliance.
okay.
So he gets really close to the guy, then he wipe him out. And so this is what
He wipes out his
Nacho
wife's
uncle.
uncle.
Yeah.
Think he was a good husband? I mean, think
Well,
he's
and of course-
a good family man.
Yeah, and the thing
that
is,
doesn't seem like a good family man.
and the thing is he doesn't, he's maintaining the position. No, it wasn't him, of course. But this is the one that really caused a problem for them because within the structure of the cartel, Nacho Cartel was the third most powerful figure.
Right.
And he was the most powerful of the non-core Sinaloa. Everybody else was from Sinaloa. He wasn't. He's operating independently. He's in Guadalajara. So, he's got control of the money laundering capital. He's got control of all of the labs. He's got control of the ports.
Cartel or?
Cartel.
Okay.
So, from Guzman's perspective, this guy's got to go.
Well, I mean, from Guzman's,
That's the way he operated. Now,
if he had the guy killed, it's going to make an awkward Thanksgiving or Christmas.
What was interesting
it's going to be weird family functions. That's going to be, right? Don't you think?
Cartel lived in the Beverly Hills section.
You're not going to take part in this at all, are you?
Cartel lived in the Beverly Hills section of Guadalajara.
Okay.
He lived there for 10 years. So when they went to arrest, how are you looking for him? You've known where he's been for years.
Right.
And so when they went to go arrest the guy, they brought 200 soldiers. They weren't taking him alive.
Right.
Because he's bribing everybody. And so he was one of those circumstances where they went to go get him and he had to die in a shootout.
Yeah, because he doesn't want to end up in a U.S.
He's not trying to go. The military guys are trying to kill him.
Yeah.
Because they're not taking him into jail because he'll just start talking.
Right.
Cartel's not taking that chance. He's going out shooting. So you have this, the shootout in the middle of Guadalajara, which resulted in him getting killed. Well, about a couple years earlier, when the Zetas started retaliating, they started adopting Sinaloa tactics like heating up the plaza. So they started sending their people into Veracruz. They started sending their people into Guadalajara. And so what Cartel did is he put together his own military wing.
It's no good when the rabbit's got the gun.
Well, yes. And so, you had Barbie with Los Negros, working for Beltran Leiva. Well, Cartel put together his crew. Now, his crew took the name Matazetas. They're the Zeta killers.
So it wasn't very imaginative.
Well, and so you had the two main organizations. You had Cartel and you had the Valencia group. And so they put together essentially their groups of hitmen into a paramilitary unit. And so Cartel assigned his nephew to oversee the entire operation. Oscar Valencia assigned Armando Valencia's son-in-law to be the captain. So Cartel's the general, the nephew's the colonel, the son-in-law is the captain. Well, the son-in-law is Mencho.
Oh yeah, Mencho was, I don't know if he, I think, is he dead now?
No,
or
Mencho's
he's
still alive. And the thing about Mencho,
he hiding or something, because he was huge for a while.
He's enormous.
Okay, well I don't know. That's
yeah, the thing about Mencho, he's
last I was heard he was in prison. I mean, I'm sorry, we were in prison talking about him and reading articles on him, but I thought for sure these guys don't have a very long shelf life.
No, he's still operating. Well, he's taking.
Remember the transcript where he he calls up the chief of police and he's like, "I'll fucking gut you like a dog. Who do you think you're saying? I'm sorry. I mean, he's on the phone threatening him for sending in some cops or something that to went somewhere. He's like, "Who do you think I am?" He's like, I'm sorry. And he's telling him,
we didn't know it was your product. We're sorry.
It's just the chief of police.
Yes, and so they put together their own paramilitary unit called the Matazetas, and that's where Mencho now was assuming some authority. Before he'd been the head of the security detail for the Valencias, but now he's basically got his own little militia that are beneath him. And so Coronel starts dispatching these guys to start attacking the Zetas. Mm-hmm. And so when Coronel gets killed, that was the main event that really caused the collapse of Sinaloa, because one, his nephew and his son and his people formed an alliance with Mencho and his people and said, you know what? We're breaking away from core Sinaloa. We're going on our own. And they called themselves the New Generation.
Right.
And so for the first 6 months of the New Generation, they essentially fought Sinaloa just to push them out of Jalisco. Like initially it was just Jalisco. They're like, oh, we're going to operate here. We'll be with you guys, but stay out of our territory. And so what was the genesis of today's probably the most powerful cartel in Mexico had its beginnings because of this foolish move on the part of Guzman taking out Nacho Coronel when, quite frankly, the entire time Coronel was completely loyal. Like he was loyal to the Federation. He just simply accumulated too much power and too much independence. Okay, so by 2012, the new cartel had been born and had begun consolidating power. And so they started out in Jalisco, soon they took over Colima, soon they took over Nayarit, and Sinaloa started getting a little concerned in the sense that you're losing control of certain assets, like they lost the 2 ports. And so what ends up happening is they end up having a fight between these 2 groups. And so things have begun slipping away, that the most powerful syndicate in the history of the drug trafficking world was no longer as formidable. You had, and we have a map that you can show the audience, and there's, the Zetas have the entire East Coast. Sinaloa has the West Coast, but now you see a chunk in the middle. And so by 2010, the chunk is like this big. By 12, it's this big. By 15, it's big. You know what I mean? You start seeing how this new generation begins to metastasize because they not only have control of the ports, they inherited the Coronel operation with respect to the precursor chemicals coming from China. And so they have the ability to produce without sharing. And so even if you cut them off from the Colombians, they're still independently able to continue generating revenue.
Right.
And so where the new generation makes their mistake, and this is now in 2015, is where you had the episode where Mencho's on the phone talking with the police chief. Well, during that time period, Sinaloa was trying to get the Mexican authorities to take out Mencho. And there were attempts to try to apprehend him. Well, they send in 5,000 guys. The new generation people end up killing several dozen of them in one attack. They send in the helicopters. They shoot the copters out of the sky. I mean, and so this is
the
Matazetas.
Yeah.
Turn new generation.
Yeah, like it's their own private. It's their own private military, and this is the government coming in with the military, the Mexican military coming in to try and capture them. They're blowing fucking helicopters out of the sky. Like is this when they like would flip over cars and set things on? They're setting buses on fire, or like just vehicles. Like they're just setting things on fire.
Knocking the vehicles over to create the impediments to block the access ways, and then what they would do is they'd run in and they started firebombing banks.
Like this is military. Like this is military kind of strategy,
because it creates chaos because they blow the safes, the vaults off the safe, or the doors off the vaults, so people start running in and start stealing money. So now it's just pandemonium because there's money flying everywhere. They're bombing banks, they're bombing buildings, they're burning buses. And so that creates the distraction necessary for their leaders to get away.
All right. I was just saying, is this the one where literally didn't it at one point like the president, it was so bad that the president said let him go? They were after somebody.
That was later on.
Okay, this I was going to say. This is more recently, where they actually did the same type of thing where they went after someone, and it got so bad the president said, "Stop, pull back, let this guy go." Like it was like civilians are being murdered and killed. Like things are on fire, buildings are on fire, banks are on fire. They're flipping over cars. Fuck it, pull back, let the guy go. Can you imagine? It's so bad that I can't ever imagine in the United States that things get so bad that they say, you know what, let that guy go. Like that's just not. But then we don't have these guys here.
Well, and then that's correct. Or the guys that are here are under strict orders to never do that.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I just meant in general, like the American, like I can't imagine that the Okeechobee Sheriff's Department would back off and be like, oh, no. But although, you know what? Although like they do it in car chases.
Yes, that's different.
Sometimes there's a car chase and they're like, hey, it's so dangerous. Fuck it. Let this guy go. He's going to kill somebody.
Yeah. When the helicopter incident happened, I remember I spoke to Valencia about it. I'm like, what are you guys doing, man?
Right.
Like that's beyond the pale because, you're provoking the Americans to get involved at that point. Mm-hmm. Because from their perspective, if you're shooting down Mexican helicopters, how do they know you don't get those shoulder fire missiles into Los Angeles and shoot out a 747?
Right.
That's how, that's from an American intelligence operative perspective or law enforcement perspective, you got to neutralize that threat. Right. And so here you had Sinaloa with their group all of a sudden saying, you know what, as bad as they may be, they're not shooting helicopters out of the sky.
Right.
And so the new generation kind of fell into the trap that the other groups did. And, where they have the mistake in, 2015 is an important year because that's the year where the government catches Chapo Guzman. And so he's out of the picture. The new generation creates this spectacle. They now get all the law enforcement attention. Guzman escapes. Mm-hmm. So now the government is like scrambling. They're trying to catch Guzman, but they got these other maniacs over here that they got to deal with.
What do you mean escapes?
He escaped the first time. The second time, remember, this is the one with the tunnel.
Yeah, I understand, but we hadn't talked about him even getting arrested again.
I just mentioned to you how the fact that he gets arrested.
Okay.
And yes, he ended up getting arrested.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it would be good to break down how he gets arrested and how he escapes.
Yeah.
That's probably a good 10-minute story.
That's a sexy story, bro. That's a sexy story. We like that.
Okay.
He's a good husband, good father. He's a decent human being.
Yeah.
He's a nice guy, and he ends up getting arrested. It's a tragedy. It's just a hardworking, peasant, made good.
Okay, so while you have all this spectacle taking place down in Jalisco, the authorities were able to get a lead on Chapo Guzman and ultimately arrest him. And
he didn't have tunnels or...
they were able to get away. But
is this when he was with the girlfriend? When he went to... They found
he was with the mistress.
Mistress. Doesn't sound like a good man.
And so they had a tunnel underneath the bathtub.
Right.
So he's naked, running through the tunnels. Him and the girl's naked. They pop up in the street. They're naked. They flag down a car. Boom, they take off. And so it's this whole little chase where they ultimately catch this guy. And what was interesting about Guzman, of course, he's obviously in the company of a woman that's not his wife, so he's got problems at home. But, so they take him to the same jail that he had previously escaped from.
Right.
So he's already familiar with the landscape. So his wife reaches out to one of her cousins, who was a high-ranking individual within the new generation, and makes an arrangement with him, saying, hey, look, we need to bust my husband out.
How long has he been arrested by this point?
It's within 6 months.
Oh, I didn't know if it was years. He
gets arrested like in January. By June, they had the huge celebratory party at the prison in California. You had 900 paisas out on the yard dancing, singing, everybody's cheering.
Wait, everybody in the prison, they knew Chapo got out and was having
a huge celebration.
In federal prison.
Yeah, it was a huge celebration.
Yeah. Like as soon as it came out.
Because in California, the majority of the prisoners are Hispanic descent.
Yeah.
The majority so out of like 1,800 men, you'll have like 1,100 guys that are either Mexican nationals or Mexican Americans. And the majority of them are cartel related. And so there was just this enormous celebration when he escaped.
So how did he escape? This is what always kills me, is the tunnel.
Yes, well, the tunnel was built. They bought a property right outside of the prison. Brought in
like half a mile to a mile and tunnel.
Yeah. Did they buy this? They bought this property like after he got arrested, or they already?
So they went and said, okay, we had to find some property. So they found a property like a little bit away from the prison. They bought the house, bring in the team of engineers.
The same engineers that are building these tunnels at Tijuana.
No, it's a different.
You don't know. Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, they just.
But, Chapo's fucking, we know, think about this. You're half a mile away, maybe a mile, whatever it is, half a mile away, let's say. We know his cell is here. We're going to dig a fucking tunnel from here, half a mile, and end up in his shower.
Yeah.
Where you cannot see it from the video camera. Like, we're going to come out exactly where there's a half wall in the shower where you cannot see it from the video camera. That's a motherfucking engineer, bro. Like, that's some math work. I mean, that's you.
Well, and they also had to take into consideration the fact that they were moving him.
Oh, they're okay.
And so his wife brought him a watch. That's why she ended up getting charged later on because she brought him a watch that they were able to use like a little tracker. Like, oh, okay.
Oh, so they're under the prison adjusting it. Like, how often
on
is he
the fly,
going
but
to
like,
Yeah.
Makes me think of, did you ever see Good Citizen? Or there was a movie called like Good Citizen where the guy, he's escaping from the prison. He's thrown in prison and things are happening all over the place. And they're like, well, he's got to be there. They're like, no, he's locked up. And they're like, move his cell. And they move his cell. Like they're moving him around and stuff. Well, eventually they realized that he knew he would be in that prison and he actually has dug all the cells out. Like there's like 12 or whatever. They're all cells that he can get out of and break out of.
And so they ended up bringing the tunnel, like I said, a half mile to a mile, ventilated. They laid tracks in there so the guy can jump, and he literally rode a motorcycle out. And so upon his release, of course, that was an enormous black eye.
Right.
How much do you think it costs the cartel to get that engineer to build that tunnel?
Those tunnels are usually going to cost you anywhere from $1 million to $2 million per tunnel.
That's Mexican. That's with a bunch of Mexicans digging the tunnels.
But this is a different operation. It was probably more expensive because normally when they started building the tunnels, they induce a group of workers to come work, build a tunnel, then they just kill the guys. So they didn't have to pay them.
Yeah.
Take them out the desert, have them dig some fucking holes, and then shoot them all in the head.
But on this one, this was a engineering feat that required professionals.
And they did it in a couple months, right?
Yeah, a few months.
It's insane.
Yeah, it's the pyramid thing.
What's that?
It's that the pyramids. Like they have the pyramids in Egypt. Like nobody believes that, the pyramids in Egypt were built by the Egyptians. They're like, it has to be alien technology or aliens or something. They couldn't build these. But there are pyramids in Mexico. Nobody doubts the Mexicans built those things. I mean, Mexicans are amazing. They'll build fucking anything. Nobody even questions it.
So,
sorry.
It's a TikTok.
Go.
what are you doing?
I'm just having fun.
All right. Okay, so when Chapo Guzman escapes, that, of course, causes a tremendous amount of embarrassment for the Mexican government. And it takes the heat off of the new generation. Now, separate of all of this, in 2015, and I'm going to say it just one time, the fentanyl crisis in the United States had become acute. And the problem was primarily of Chinese origin. The overwhelming majority of cases were being shipped from China to the United States, the material. And so the American administration, Trump administration, negotiated a deal with Xi Jinping, the president of China, and persuaded them to allow the American Postal Service to work hand in hand with China Post to reduce the amount of material coming into the United States. And so now This, of course, was something that the Chinese didn't want to abide by because it's a lucrative market. So what do? They reach out to the Mexicans and say, hey, what if we send you the precursors?
Right.
You manufacture right there. Well, they're already running a series of labs. I mean, there was well over 100 labs operating in the methamphetamine context.
Right.
So now they're just simply saying, you know what, we can just start producing the material there. And so that was the structure of what was the genesis for that particular opioid. Now you'll notice they were working with the new generation. At this point, it's got nothing to do with Sinaloa. And so for the next 6 months, Guzman's running wild, because at this point you got a full court press trying to find him. And so this kind of takes the heat off the new generation. They're focusing on Guzman. Meanwhile, the new generation starts building this new capacity because they already had the business relationships with the precursor traffickers in China. They're working with the 14K, not only in the money laundering context, but they're also working with the triad in the precursor context. This is just another arrow in their quiver.
All right.
And so you slowly start seeing this buildup. About 6 months later, Guzman gets arrested. He gets taken out of the picture. Their decision at that point was, we're going to send him to the United States.
Sean Penn. The Sean Penn thing where Guzman had kind of like a crush on an actress.
Kate Del Castillo.
And so he's sweet on her. And so Sean Penn connects with her and agrees that he wants to interview this Sean Penn, the actor, wants to interview Chapo. Mm-hmm. So he speaks with the Mexican female, the actress, and she's already talking with Guzman, correct? And so she ends up. She ends up saying, look, I got this guy that wants to meet you. He wants to interview you, blah, blah, blah. So they actually they arrange a meeting. Well, aren't the Mexicans tracking Sean Penn?
The Americans.
The Americans are tracking Sean Penn.
Not tracking him, phones.
The phones, okay. Well, and so I just remember reading the article in Rolling Stone magazine where when they go to do the meet, they tell him, you got to get in the trunk of the car. And he's like, that's not part of the deal. And they're like, get in the fucking trunk of the car. Like, it's like, right? Yeah. Doesn't he get thrown in the trunk of a car or something like that? Like, he's like, didn't see that coming at all. And like, they're throwing a bag over his head, the whole thing. Suddenly it's like, oh, this is getting real.
Yeah.
And they drive him around and whatever. And they bring him to where Chapo is. And was it that got him caught specifically, or was just the phone? It was the phones that they were tracking. I mean, obviously, he didn't have anything to do with it. He didn't know any of this was happening. Sean Penn.
He had no idea.
And he interviews Sean Penn. I mean, Sean Penn interviews him, writes a whole article and everything. But
how'd the government know that he was going to go see him?
This is probably NSA fucking knows everything, bro.
Released what prompted them to become suspicious, because she was a famous actress.
Right.
She played a drug lord in a novella. And so every drug trafficker in Mexico had a crush on this girl.
Right.
I mean, and so she was trying to build like a tequila brand. It was one of those type of things. And so next thing you know, she's talking to an intermediary and she ends up getting into this prospective business relationship. She ultimately became under investigation and Mexican cleared her. But you knew what you were doing. Mm-hmm. They just didn't.
They got bigger problems.
They got bigger problems than an actress.
Her trying to get El Chapo to say, "Oh, she's trying to get a TikTok she could shoot around."
And so when they removed him from the equation in 2016, that they neutralized him by putting him into prison. And at this point, they're like moving him every day. Boom, 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 boom. No watches. And they moved him from the prison that he's previously in to a prison closer to the border. And so now he's not even in Sinaloa, Jalisco, anything. Now he's like in just outside of Texas.
We're not falling for the banana in the tailpipe routine. It's not happening again. Yeah.
Yes. And so at that point, with him out of the way, you have the new generation on the complete warpath, bolstered by the new market that they were creating, which was in the synthetic opioid context. Meanwhile, Sinaloa isn't so much in disarray, because at that point, Guzman really hadn't been exercising much authority. He's been spending all his time running around, avoiding the authorities and hooking up with this actress. And so his sons had stepped up to take over his organization. And this is where the problem within the Sinaloa context came in, because they started embracing the synthetic opioids.
Hey, sorry to interrupt the video. Just want to let you guys know that we're going to have an extra 15 or 20 minutes of content on my Patreon. It's $10 a month for about an hour's worth of extra content every single week. Back to the podcast.
And so you had the split within the group where the old guard, the Zambada types, they didn't want anything to do with the synthetic opioids. You had this huge problem in the United States, and it was going to increase by orders of magnitude, and it has. And the older guys are like, hey, we don't want nothing to do with this. The younger guys are like, hey, we're not listening to you guys. And so you had actually a split within Sinaloa. So you've got the Chapo-related individuals, not Guzman Sr., Guzman Juniors, essentially they call them the Los Chapitos. These guys...
What does that mean? Little Chapos?
Little Chapos.
Oh.
Yeah. So Los Chapitos...
I bet they love that.
They embraced...
Did they?
Well, I'm not sure about the name, but I'm sure they embraced the particular compound. And that has caused nothing but problems for that particular syndicate. Because at this point, they've collapsed to where you've got essentially two different groups. That's why I previously indicated that when the government talks about Sinaloa cartel, there's no Sinaloa cartel. There's a handful of groups that are involved in the synthetics. There's the remainder that want nothing to do with it. Now, the incident you were talking about earlier is when Guzman's son gets apprehended.
Okay.
And that's when they reached out to Zambada, and Zambada said, okay, we're going to bail you out of trouble, but this is it. So they sent all their men into the actual city, and the police chief had to back down and say, let the guys go. But that was the last instance where you really had any coordination between the two groups. And so today, the landscape in Mexico is just fundamentally different than what it was 10 years ago, much less 30 years ago. And going forward, what we're essentially waiting on is the fracturing of the new generation, because they've made the same mistake that all of the other groups made other than Sinaloa, because Sinaloa, like I said, was a horizontally based organization. New generation is vertical. Mental controls on a top-down level. And when you've got a group that's essentially a cult of personality, when you remove the guy at the top,
it falls apart.
It falls apart.
Very quick.
There's no resilience to the organization. Whereas the previous one, you had a 30-year run. Now,
you would think they would adopt the 30-year run model.
Yes, but that requires having the franchise model where we say, well, we're going to delegate responsibility for certain areas of responsibility to you and entrust you with it.
Yeah.
That's a very enlightened manner in which to conduct organized crime. And essentially the only group that ever operates on that principle are the Chinese. Israelis don't, the Russians don't, the Italians don't. I've known men from each of those groups. They're all top-down, very control-oriented. Whereas in the Chinese context, they value the individuals who are able to operate outside of their group, which is how Sinaloa operated for decades.
Right.
Because in the end, the men that are important aren't the guys in Mexico, are the Carries.
Right.
Or the Dannys, or in my case, Robles, or Aria, or any of these guys that are the American-based distributors.
So Chapo got moved to the United States, went to trial.
Yes.
Lost, obviously. He's in ADX now?
He's in ADX, yes.
So was it the Mexican government who went and got El Chapo?
Well,
or
yeah, their military swooped in and grabbed him.
And why are they taking him to the United States?
Because they know eventually they know he'll escape
they
something
can't take the kind of embarrassment.
So they're just like, go to the United States so he can
he's
stay.
got fucking 50 different indictments, like he's wanted by the United States, and they're like, look, we can't, like, even if we find him guilty, which they will.
Here's one of, like this one here, just all these guys, well, he's at the very top. And so I'll shoot this area. But that way, it's just...
Well, I was going to say, like, even if they convict him and give him a life in prison in Mexico, at some point, he's going to convince a group of guys to bust him out or pay a guard or something. He's going to get out. And like, how embarrassing is it? You've already proven you cannot keep this guy in a Mexican prison. And so they're like, he's so much trouble. Give him to the Americans. And it's just, it terrifies every other drug lord to get caught, which of course, they fight back way harder, but it's like, it's getting more and more serious. It's letting them know, look, we'll hand you over to the fucking Americans. Like, it's like, Jesus.
Like with him, when they stormed, he was reaching for his AK-47.
Right. He's ready to go out in a blaze of glory.
But he had his wife and his kids there.
Right.
And so his wife's the one who's screaming like, no, he's the father of my children.
Right.
He's got his little girls there. He's like trapped. Whereas, absent that circumstance, I'm sure he'd have gone the natural Coronel route.
Right. Well, now he's in ADX. You know what ADX is? So it's in Florence, Colorado, correct?
It's a Supermax at Florence, Colorado.
Yeah. Like it's a Supermax. Like you can't get any higher. It's just.
And that's where he is.
It's supposedly it's like no contact. Like you have a shower that moves from cell to cell, so you get to take a shower when they like strap you down and handcuff you and everything. If you have to see the doctor, like everybody's coming to your room, you're not leaving your room really. I think you probably get out at some point.
It's like 23-hour lockdown, but after it's like a step down program.
Right.
After you've been there for a few years, they start allowing like limited interaction.
They're giving you little babies, baby incentives to be good, but not that you could be bad. But the other thing is like supposedly like you don't get mail. They scan all your mail. You read it on a monitor. Like, it's just so overwhelmingly controlled. Honestly, it's like, to me, it's fucking horrific. Like, but then again, these are the most horrific people too.
And the people that go there are, I'm assuming are mostly life sentences.
Yeah. They're like,
well, most of the guys, a good number of the individuals at the maximum security level are doing life sentences.
Yeah.
These are the individuals who cannot function in even a maximum security level context. So whether they're, hardcore gang members that just
terrorists
can't program, individuals like terrorists that they want to segregate from the population. Also large drug lords. Wedo Palma was there. Osil Cardenas was there.
Unabomber. Wasn't the Unabomber there?
When Unabomber was there.
He's a homegrown terrorist. I don't know if you know Ted Kaczynski. Unbelievable, this guy. And I tell you right now, I'm half a fucking tard. Like I barely know anything. And okay. So yeah, Ted Kaczynski was, he believed, I forget what they call it, but he wanted to eliminate technology. He wanted us to go back to living, like old, like, you make everything kind of like, you make everything. There's no technology, anything. By the way, this is the guy who went to, was it MIT?
One of them type schools, like UC Berkeley or whatever.
Yeah, this guy's super smart. He was like I think he was even a professor or for a little bit, but he was super smart, but something's not right. And he would write these manifestos and these long-winded articles or essays about how we were destroying the planet and all these things, right? So eventually he starts he saves up some money, he buys a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and he starts making bombs and sending them to airlines. And so, one time they get a package and open it up, and like the secretary loses her fingers but doesn't kill her. So he gets a little bit better. He starts mailing them, and I think ultimately he may have killed 4 or 5 people, whatever. Yeah. The point is that he's getting better at it, and it's terrorism. You're blowing people, and people are terrified by it. And there were a few drawings where people were like, I saw this guy and he'd have a hoodie on and glasses, and you could tell he hadn't shaved or whatever. He looked rugged, he's dirty, and he dropped the package off. Like they had a couple people like, this guy, we saw this guy, he's kind of odd. And so they start looking for him. They've got this sketch drawing. Well, eventually he starts writing letters to the editor of of a newspaper, and he says, hey, listen, I'm the Unabomber, and I'm going to blow up another whatever. And I don't think they believe him. And then something goes off, and then they think, oh shit, we got him.
Yeah, he demanded to be able to write.
Right. So, but at some point they take him serious. Yeah. And what happens is he says, I'm going to write I want you to publish this letter that I'm writing. It's a little one of his little mini manifestos, right? So they go to the FBI, and the FBI makes a decision, publish it. Now they do change a few things, which he's furious about. But ultimately what happens is it gets out there. His brother reads it, and Ted Kaczynski's brother explains it to his wife, shows his wife, calls like another relative. They discuss it. And I think ultimately they convince him, like, you have to call, he's killing people. I don't give a fuck his brother or not, he's killing people. Calls like somehow or another the FBI, they get in touch with the FBI shows up and he's like, I'm telling you, it's my brother. He goes and finds some paperwork in his mother or something that he had actually had examples of his writings and, you know, the way he's phrasing his sentences is whatever. And so they look at it and they're like, oh, definitely the same guy. And so he tells them, like, do you know where he is? He's like, I do know where he is. And he tells them where he is. And they stake out the little shed or whatever. And eventually they come and they grab him. And, and you know, they go into the little shed. They actually picked up the entire shed. They like put it on like a truck or a helicopter or something, actually move the whole shed. It's his house, but it's not that big. And they move it and analyze the whole thing. And I mean, it's so overwhelmingly obvious. Like he's got some of the things like the boards and stuff to make the devices, like it's like carved out of wood, and you know, and even some of the wires and stuff he'd taken out of an abandoned vehicle from a neighbor, and these neighbors are a mile away, from a neighbor who had an abandoned car that was falling apart. He actually goes in and steals wires and stuff. He has no real money, and but yeah, they put it together, and that's it. He's guilty. It's this. And then he actually, in ADX, eventually was allowed to get visits. And like, I don't forget the organization, but he became kind of almost like a folklore kind of leader of this organization that they just thought he was wonderful. And it's this organization that's put together that's basically saying we should abandon all technology and go back to farming. And they would come see him and write him letters and send him money. But he was in ADX. I mean, he died recently.
He was at Dublin.
Oh,
when I was there.
Yeah. No, I know he was on the.
But they kept him in the shoe.
Yeah, it was a death penalty case, right?
You were locked up with him at a time.
I was at the same place.
Facility.
Yeah, he was kept in the shoe.
Yeah,
and so
he was. Do you know who the Oklahoma City bomber was?
I've heard that.
Okay,
but I don't know anything about it.
He was. What was his name? It was
Timothy McVeigh.
Timothy McVeigh. He was there with Timothy McVeigh too.
Who?
You weren't you? No. Oh, I thought you were there. I thought Timothy McVeigh was.
No, it's the Unabomber.
Just a Unabomber?
Just a Unabomber.
Oh, I've been telling people you were locked up with both of them.
No.
What's wrong with that? Oh, you're too good for Timothy McVeigh?
I'm just saying McVeigh wasn't he was in Oklahoma, I think.
I mean, no, it was still ended up federal, didn't it?
No, but once he was convicted, he went to Terre Haute. He went to death penalty.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
he okay. Yeah. But it was.
Yeah, now Unabomber didn't get capital charges. He went to ADX.
Oh.
McVeigh went to Terre Haute.
Yeah, Timothy McVeigh got the death penalty. He died. It was a lethal injection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll never forget the Timothy McVeigh thing. This is a horrible thing. It's just I always remember the interview with him where they were like, "What did you think? Like when the bomb goes off?" So he put it in the federal building in Oklahoma City. He thought he was taking out the FBI field office, which is in this building. Well, he finds out like the day before, a couple days before, there's also a kindergarten.
Daycare, like a daycare.
Daycare. And his response was collateral damage. Like, oh, well,
yeah,
so they have to die. And he drives the truck, puts it under there. It blows up, of course, kills, 20, 30 children, and takes out a whole bunch of people in the field office, too, of the FBI. But I think that they actually had, a lot of people didn't even come in until later. And so he didn't get as many, what he thought. But what I remember, the chilling thing was he parks the vehicle, gets out, and he's walking away when the bomb goes off. So he's walking to his back. Boom! Shakes everything. He said he waited a second, turned around. He said, I kept telling myself, like, don't turn around. And he said, finally, I just turned around and looked. and what is it? 2/3 or 1/3 of the building is just gone. It's just gutted. And they said, so when the FBI was questioning him, they said, what did you think at that moment? He said, I was disappointed. And they said, why? He said, I really thought I was going to be able to take down the whole building.
Wow.
He said, and when I saw that only 30 or 50% of it was taken down, he said, I really thought he said, I just, didn't have enough, explosives. And
what was this guy's story issue? Like what led him to do that?
He actually was in the, so he he had tried out for the Marines and failed. He had gotten, so he got new boots just beforehand when he went to try out for the Marines. And he ended up getting a sore or something on his boots because they were new. Mm-hmm. And he ended up having to drop out. Right. So he had been in the military, he'd been in the military, right, and tried out for whatever it was, the Marines, mm-hmm. whatever. He couldn't do it, for whatever reason, it didn't work out. And then he kind of just hung out, and he had read. This is always interesting. He'd read, or when they caught him, he had a copy of the Turner Diaries. Okay. So he was a big believer in there would someday be a race war in the United States, right? So he's a racist. And the Turner Diaries is a fictitious book that's written by a guy named Turner about a race war in the United States. So he had that book, and a lot of these guys have that book, Homegrown Terrorists. So he had that book on him, and he actually, during, what was the one, what was the Branch Davidians? Where was that?
In Texas.
In Texas. So
Waco.
In Waco, Texas. He was actually there when the ATF goes into the Branch Davidian complex and keeps it, and they're holding it, and they got tanks surrounding the place. They're trying to get these guys out of this compound. But there are people that are parked up and down the street, like that are parking out, like watching this whole thing. They actually interview Timothy McVeigh. He's there.
Wow.
So they have an interview with him. So he basically drives around the United States for like a year or two, kind of hanging out after he drops out of the military. And, he's disenfranchised, and he's probably a smart guy that life is not turning out the way he wants. He's disappointed. Turns into a homegrown terrorist. He decides that he hates the federal government. He's disgusted. And then they've got all these things that there are reasons. They always have these reasons.
Yeah, Ruby
Ridge and the federal government's too powerful, and they're taking our guns and our rights. And, and there's some people like, I get that. I'm upset about that, but I'm not blowing anything up, bro. So, he ends up getting together with another guy, and they decide to start bombing things like that's how kind of the race war starts in the Turner Diaries, is they start blowing things up like FBI buildings and shit. So he and another guy, they get the chemicals, they mix it all up. The one guy doesn't go through with it. Is that correct?
Nichols participates, and then there's a second guy who
gets spooked. He's like, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. Once he realizes, oh shit, this is for real. Like sitting around shooting the shit with your little racist buddies is, all fun and games until somebody starts mixing up a batch of gets a couple 5-gallon buckets, and then it's like, 50-gallon buckets, and it's like, yeah, guys, I'm out. So he ends up renting a vehicle, a big truck, right, like a moving truck, and they load it up with the chemicals, and he drives to the Oklahoma City federal building where they have the FBI field office, and he parks the vehicle right underneath the building, or just kind of in the front, as close as he can get it to being really underneath. I think kind of in the front, right? Mm-hmm. And then he gets out and he's got the timers, and he just starts walking away, and he knows I've got about 30 seconds to a minute, and he's a minute down the road, and boom. And then so for all of his planning, first of all, these guys have no money. So it takes them a long time to get all the chemicals together. And had they had more money, they're the kind of knuckleheads that probably would have been, somebody probably would have realized that you're buying way too much fertilizer, for the average citizen. Somebody might have raised red flags, but it took them so long to get the chemicals together that they were undetected. You get a bunch of chemicals and you mix them up in the appropriate mix, and you've got yourself, a big boom. And so they mix them up. They do a lot of research. It's very well planned out and thought out. And for all of that planning and thought process, the guy ends up having a vehicle that he gets into that's got like an expired tag. He doesn't have like a driver. Like after the bomb, they didn't think much of it, of what's happening. And he gets pulled over. Like he gets pulled over within like the day. He gets pulled over, and I mean, it's like got like an expired tag and no license, and this just falls apart. You know, it just falls apart, and they're looking for him because they start checking all the local motels, and somehow or another he's recognized or something. I forget.
And they
exactly.
just found out it was him by checking the cameras and seeing that he was the one who left.
There wasn't cameras back then.
No, there's no
Or
camera.
how do they know it was him?
Well, because they start checking the motels, and it's like anybody who's out of town, who's fits this description or whatever it was, and somehow or another he's on some list, or if I forget, I don't know exactly. But either way, they figure out this is a person of interest, and he's driving out of town, and he gets pulled over.
Well,
And
the FBI had infiltrated all those groups.
right,
And
so they
I'm
must
sure
have.
yes. And so on an investigation of that nature, they bring in 1,000 agents.
But he was caught right away.
Yeah,
this wasn't 6 months or
like
2
a
years
day
later
or something.
Yeah. And he's pulled over, and he doesn't fight it out. I think he had a weapon and everything. He doesn't shoot it out. He gets arrested. He goes downtown. He doesn't deny that he's done any of these things. He starts talking because he kind of feels like I'm going to be a beacon or a martyr to this
inspiration.
Yeah, to this group. And and we're going to start it's all going to be the Turner Diaries, all for it. And of course, it doesn't. The FBI had not turned over a whole bunch of evidence, and he could have probably gotten a retrial, but he'd already gotten the death penalty. And they're like, "Do you want a retrial?" And he said, "No." Like he was okay with dying.
No, they were filing.
No, they were filing on his behalf, but
Yeah.
he wasn't fighting it. Like, my understanding is he wasn't even really interested in having a retrial or having anything. He was ready to go.
Yeah, new sentencing proceeding they were asking for.
Right. But I don't know. You probably know more than me, but I had heard that like they were trying to get his lawyers were trying to get it overturned, and he wasn't concerned about getting it overturned. He was like, "I'm ready. This is it." I mean, to me, if I had done something that horrific and killed that many people and done that, to me, I'd be like, "Look, ultimately, this is what's going to happen." And he didn't mind being an inspiration. I don't know anybody that has been inspired, but
Yeah, no, and his co-defendant was at ADX, Nichols.
oh, okay.
In fact, that guy that you had spoken with that wanted to come on your show, Scarpa Jr.,
Oh yeah,
was
yeah.
in there with Nichols.
Oh yeah.
And the guys that did the original bombing from 93,
Oh yeah, yeah. Original bombing for what?
the World Trade Center.
World Trade Center. Okay, yeah. Which, because the World Trade Center, somebody had tried to take down the World Trade Center, and they blew up a truck and everything.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I know it had caught fire before, but
Yeah,
Caught fire.
Yeah.
No, they tried bombing
they
it.
tried to blow it up, but it didn't. It just shook the building. Wasn't enough to, and that got tracked down because somebody had rented the van in their their real name, and they found
Mahmoud Abu Hima or something like that.
they found
Yeah,
the
he was at
VIN
Leavenworth.
number. They had the VIN number. They tracked the VIN number all the way back. Rental car, boom, got him. Like, listen, when they really want to bust you, they're going to figure it out. This whole, we couldn't put the case together. Really?
No.
Come on, bro.
When they put 100 guys on it like that,
You're going to come up with
it's over
something.
with.
Yeah. So, so that's where Chapo is. That was a long Chapo explanation. But yeah, that's where he is right now. So he's now being, he's now reading all of his,
Remember, he can't read.
mail.
He's got third or fourth grade education. He's got to be miserable.
Well, he's got a chance to learn to read now.
I'm sure
You could figure it out now.
Are they doing so? They're not doing tunnels, and
ADX? No, not in the U.S. No.
No, they've got sensors on the ground all around that. I mean, it's that highly fortified.
Yeah.
I mean, most of it's subterranean already as it is.
Listen, if you couldn't read and you were in there, I wonder how long it would be before you really started thinking about committing suicide.
you know what would be a good podcast? No, is going over like prison escapes, like taking like the 4 greatest prison escapes. Because I remember there was one you talking about like Hitler flying people in, like parachuting in.
El Duce, when he
Oh, okay, yes, That's from Italy.
parachute
like
down on the
4
prison
and going over like the details, and that'd be good. But anyways, yeah. So
I mean, for
Chapo.
all of Hitler's faults, he didn't forget his friends.
What was that guy's name?
The
Mussolini.
Mussolini. Yeah, they called him El Duce. Yeah. They overthrew him, threw him in prison, and they said, "Hey, Hitler, you know this happened?" He said, "What? Not El Duce. Send in the paratroopers." They landed and busted him out. Put him back in, and then say, "Okay, oh, what? Now let's go back in and march back in, take the country back over, put him back into power," which didn't last very long.
Could do Napoleon also.
Huh? Oh, yeah, Napoleon escaped too.
Elba.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do that like one time. So let's get back to El Chapo. So or the whole cartel. So he's locked up in the max
Isn't that pretty much it?
That's pretty much
it, bro. Pete had gotten to he had talked about him getting caught and being thrown in prison. They were moving him around. I was just letting everybody know he's been moved to the United States.
Yeah, and what year was he was arrested? What, 2015?
He was arrested. Well, he was apprehended the second time in 2016.
And then moved to America.
He was extradited to the United States in 2017.
Yeah.
And then he went to trial in 19.
Yeah. He went to New York for a few years, right? Till eventually his trial went through. And then they moved him to ADX. He listened, and it was like he couldn't see his wife. They barely let him have access to anything. He was having their lawyers are filing for everything. Mm-hmm. He had so little contact with anybody.
And so what's the current status of the cartels?
Well, as of right now, the new generation is dominant. And so long as Mencho remains in place, it's going to remain the same. But as indicated earlier, it's essentially a cult of personality. When you have a top-down organization like that, it's just a matter of time when the top guy falls, it's going to be a massive fragmentation. And, from the American perspective, that's an even more dangerous circumstance, because what you're going to have now is all these little groups trying to maximize profits. And this is how we ended up in the circumstances that we are. At least before, when we had an enormous superstructure 20 years ago, sure, they were making a lot of money and they were flooding the product into the country, but the fatality rate was nowhere near what it is today. So you've got smaller groups having a disproportionate effect. Whereas before, when you had a larger group, well, they could make their money on volume. They didn't have to worry about maximizing profits per unit. And so once the new generation falls, you're going to see, unfortunately, a tremendous spike in more American fatalities, particularly so long as the Chinese continue to keep flooding them with... Oops, am I allowed to talk about the Chinese?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or, no, you don't have to say Chinese. So long as the triads continue supplying them with...
fentanyl.
Yeah.
Or precursor products.
Precursors.
Yeah. Hey, I appreciate you guys watching the video. Please do me a favor and subscribe, hit the bell so you get notified of videos like this. Also, share the video. Please consider joining my Patreon. We're putting exclusive content on Patreon. It's $10 a month. It really helps Colby and I produce as many podcasts as we're putting out. We are putting out a ton of podcasts because we're going on the quantity over quality formula, strategy, whatever. Anyway, I appreciate you guys, and leave me a comment and check all the links we have in the description. See ya.